Um, Friends, colleagues, thank you all for joining us. Just to let you know, we're going to record the session today to make it available on social media afterwards. So I'm now recording the session. My name is Rory O'Connell, not Maria Prince, as it appears on your screen. And I am in the Transitional Justice Institute and School of Law at Ulster University, one of the organisers of a seminar on deliberating constitutional futures, along with my colleague Eilish Rooney. That took place on the 18th of February of this year. And we'll say a bit more about that workshop and the report from it later. But we wanted to start with some very distinguished guests, Avila Kilmurray, Andrei Murphy, and Aoife Kane, talk about some of the issues raised in our report and to discuss or look at the debate around the border poll. Avila Kilmurray is with the Social Change Initiative and has many years of experience in philanthropy and community work. Andrei Murphy and Aoife Kane are two extremely prominent local commentators who are engaged in many public debates. We're really delighted that they are in a position to join us this morning. If you do have anything you want to comment on during the course of the morning, please do use the chat function. But now I'm going to hand you over to Avila to start the first half of our session.
Thank you very much, Rory, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You never know where people are with Zoom these days. Thank you for joining us, and I'm delighted that we have Andrei and Alex with us to broaden our discussion. I have a couple of questions to put to them that I've drawn out of the report, and I would encourage you to read the report, Deliberating Constitutional Futures. It throws up a lot of material. We won't have time this morning to go through it all, but hopefully we can. You can come back, with comments and questions. And as Rory says, there is the chat function there as well for your comments. So the first question I suppose I have, which is related to referenda generally, is that on the one hand, referendums can be seen as the purest form of democracy, direct democracy. On the other hand, and Brexit comes to mind, you can be talking about the sort of the tyranny of majoritarianism, the 50% plus one syndrome. So I'd like to ask perhaps Andrei first and then Alex, what are your thoughts on the pros and cons of a referendum on the constitutional futures in this island, and what are the risks and the opportunities? Andrei.
Thanks, Avila, and thanks everyone for asking me to be part of this conversation. And I was lucky enough to be given a pre-look at the report from Eilish, and it's absolutely brilliant. And I just want to commend you on a really important report in terms of raising all of the different issues that are kind of glanced over in many conversations, but not really interrogated. So I think that it's a really important contributor. In terms of your question, Avila, I suppose the report is useful in this as well to tease out a little bit of that kind of 50+1 idea, because to date, when this is raised, the conversation usually goes along the lines of, well, if 50+1 is okay to maintain the union, then 50+1 must be okay to end the union with Britain and form a new Ireland. And I suppose expanding that conversation a bit will do none of us any harm at all, because we need to do that. Since partition, I suppose we've lived with a tyranny of majority, if we want to call it something like that. A pro-union majority was deliberately created. Objections were repressed, often violently, during the past 100 years. So we know what unhealthy majoritarianism can look like. So, if we're going to have a new Ireland or a referendum where, whichever way the cookie falls, it'll probably be slim. We have to make sure that whoever is in the sizable minority is going to have a different experience to what has gone before. And I think that that's the real the real challenge, but also the real opportunity of this conversation, for us to recognise that what went in the past hasn't worked, but what can come in the future as a result of this conversation, even without a result of the referendum, can be really important. And I suppose what we have to ensure is that if, for instance, and I'm an overt nationalist, if we were successful in having a new form of Ireland, a united Ireland of a type, that the identity of a unionist minority on the island doesn't disappear. And it must be afforded a dignity, I think, that was never afforded to Irish citizens in the northern state. It needs to be a completely different experience. And that's the real opportunity, I think. How do we build a new Ireland where everyone is cherished equally? And I think that the debate over the past 3 years has seen this grow, and there's a real and deliberate intent in many of the conversations to ensure that unionism does not feel disempowered in any way. And I suppose most people will say that if 50+1 is the rule, and it is, that's not the ideal scenario. We want to have a situation where any change is at least engaged with, and people are engaged in planning. And I think that Peter Robinson was really interesting in how he has framed his interventions around on that.
Thanks very much. Alex, what's your opinion on it?
Well, morning, and again, thank you for the invitation to join you this morning. I've spent most of lockdown in my home, so it's actually nice to be invited, even in virtual form, almost anywhere to speak to people. So, hello. I think the whole thing about the border poll, the referendum, I've been thinking about it a lot, because it's almost 50 years since the Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath, I think it was November 1971, made a speech which really spoke to unionists at the time, when basically said, if there comes a point when it looks like there may be a majority for United Ireland, we will accommodate it, as long as it's done by democratic means. A British government will accommodate. Somehow, I think with unionism, and I think all of us, both sides have known for a very long time that this moment was always going to come. It wasn't just demographics, all sorts of other political things come into play as well. But there was going to come a point when we were asked to make a choice about, what the identity is. Now, I understand this 50%+1. Oddly enough, part of me doesn't really mind so much about that, because in terms of Brexit, we took it, one vote missing. You can't turn around, 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 years later and go, well, that was okay for that, but it's not okay for this. But one thing is clear, that a majority, either 50%+1 to stay in the United Kingdom, or 50%+1 to go into United Ireland, however form that would manifest itself, that's going to be enormously difficult to pull off, because it's too tight there. I would like to see a larger margin one way or the other, but I don't know how you write that in. But I think the other thing that's really important, we certainly learned it from Brexit, and lessons learned from the Scottish referendum, you need to be prepared. Now, it's quite clear, if you look at civic nationalism, the 32 movement, the big movement, the big meeting that was held in the Waterfront Hall 2 or 3 years ago, there's quite clearly something happening on the ground there. I've seen a lot of documents. I think Sinn Féin have another document coming out this Friday. There is something going on within nationalism, within Republicanism. There's a very clear sense. Maybe I over-egg it to say they think it's inevitable. I don't think anything's inevitable, but certainly, their tails are up in a way they haven't been for many, many years. My worry would be, obviously, as a unionist, is that we're not taking any of this completely seriously, in this sense of which was what made Peter Robinson's comments in his newsletter column a couple of weeks ago so important. And I think he said it 2 years ago as well, when his first lecture as peace professor and so on. He said, unionism needs to think about border polls. It needs to think about the future. It needs to think about how it promotes its values and its beliefs and so on. And you can see behind me, this is my Sherlock Holmes collection, and you won't be in front of me. There's a quote from Sherlock Holmes, which is that there is nothing as instructive as the observation of trifles. One of my jobs, I always think, as a commentator, is to look for the little things that are happening, the little moment, start piling the evidence together, because when you get the evidence together, then only certain conclusions become almost inevitable. And as a unionist, my view would be, just actually as an observer, forget the unionism thing and that, I think, without saying it's inevitable, a border poll is now far more likely than it's ever been before, and unionism needs to start on that basis. Even if it doesn't expect one, even if it could be 5, 10 years down the line, it must, like Robinson said, unionism must go along on the basis that there will be a border poll. Do not be caught on the hop. That's what happened with Brexit at the time, and that's what we're seeing in the aftermath of Brexit. People hadn't, neither side, to be honest, neither side did, because Cameron hadn't prepared to lose and the Leave people hadn't prepared to win. That must not happen again. But the other thing which I think will be crucial in all this when we talk, it is clear that nationalism and republicanism seem to be ready. It's clear that unionism isn't and needs to work. It won't be taken seriously as a debate, I suspect, until we know what the input from the British and Irish governments is going to be. So the Irish government say, look, it's up to you, make up your own mind. And the British government say, you know, if both those governments are involved big time, making statements, setting out plans, saying this is what happens if you stay in the United Kingdom, this is what happens if you lose, the unionists lose the vote. That becomes a big major debate which people will listen to. If both those governments take the view, you know, just it's what you do, it's up to you. Our job is just to keep a watching brief. It's not our job. You know, we are not going to take sides, because if an Irish and British government do not take sides in this debate, it becomes a totally different debate.
Sure. And just following your Sherlock Holmes reference.
I can talk about them all day if you want.
Well, you know, the Belfast Agreement, you know, gives the power to the Secretary of State to decide when this should be held, and whether a referendum will be held. I mean, for the unionist population, is that a bit like having the Hound of the Baskervilles outside the back door?
Oh, for unionism, we've had the Hound of the Baskervilles and his spawn at the back door for 70, 80, 100 years, you know, because it's one thing as a unionist. I mean, I'm comfortable, I'm confident in my unionism. I know what I believe in. But I think as a political force, I think unionism, it always sees the worst. It always assumes that everyone is against it. And sometimes it becomes this inevitable thing that if you keep portraying everyone as your enemy, suddenly everyone has become your enemy. But in terms of the border poll provision in the Good Friday Agreement, the problem with that is it isn't just unionists, you know, who don't quite understand. It's the same with nationalists, because it's very vague. We're told, you know, the Secretary of State, if he thinks that there might be a majority of a united Ireland, he will call a border poll. But we've no idea what the evidence is going to use. So at the minute, just for the sake of argument, there is not a majority of unionism in the Assembly. There isn't a majority of unionist MPs going to Westminster. If you add up the 462 local councillors in Northern unionism, and I'm defining those who use the term unionist or pro-union in their election literature, are also a minority of councillors, a slim minority. So somebody could argue, hang on, these guys are not winning elections. These guys are not forming a majority in the following institutions. Is that not an argument, Secretary of State, to have a border poll and so on? So I think we should just assume it goes back to Robinson's point. Since we don't know what the evidence that the Secretary of State will use, and he will need input. No Secretary of State is going to call a border poll just on the British Prime Minister. The Irish need an input and so on. But again, I can understand. I think Sammy Wilson asked the Secretary of Granton Lewis 2 or 3 weeks ago in the House of Commons, asked him a question on what are the terms and conditions for calling this border poll. And the Secretary of State gave a wonderfully vague answer, you know, tremendously proud of himself. But again, it left us all in exactly the same mess. None of us, unionism doesn't know, nationalism doesn't know, neither government. There just comes a point, and that's what worries me in all these things. Too often when it comes to dealing with Northern Ireland, a decision is made without any great detailed thought, and suddenly, like that, you're told, all right, we now have a border poll.
Andrei, just picking up on that, you know, I mean, where do you feel that the sort of Micheál Martin's, you know, shared island initiative, what sort of framing does that give to the sort of the idea of a border poll or not?
I suppose for many people looking at the shared island unit, it looked like it was a recognition of the debate that has undoubtedly been happening since the Brexit vote. So you had the Brexit vote and then you had the collapse of the institutions. Much of what kept down the institutions was around Irish identity, Irish cultural expression, all of those issues, and the lack of capacity perceived by many of the Northern Executive or Strand 1 of the Good Friday Agreement to be able to deliver on Irish citizenship rights or Irish cultural rights. So those things came together and collided and created a real sense of, well, the Good Friday Agreement's under threat. The majority of people in the North voted to remain in the EU. The majority of people in England and Wales voted to come out of it. So against our will, we're coming out of the EU. you have this lack of delivery on the rights agenda, and particularly Irish citizenship and cultural rights. And so that all collided to create this environment whereby people start looking at the constitutional question in a whole different way probably since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So in the context of that, Dublin has been 3 steps behind. They've been absolutely up there in terms of Brexit, but we can see that it's very much from a Dublin-centric economic point of view that they've been espousing the Good Friday Agreement far more than the rights of people across the border who have an Irish identity. And then the demand on the constitutional question grows, Dublin is found really being very resistant. And talking about things like the whole conversation being divisive and things like that. But in comes sideways their general election, and they realise, no, this is actually an issue. And so they make some sort of commitment to some sort of shared island unit. And they've gone and they've set it up. And it looks very much like the cross-border kind of commitments that were already there in the NDNA, or have been kind of long-standing anyway. But there's definitely a nod toward the constitutional question in that. But what it doesn't do is let us do exactly what Alex is talking about. It isn't allowing us to plan for what the poll will even ask. It doesn't say, well, what are the different permutations of what a changed island and changed economic structure, what would that look like? It doesn't engage with things like federal structures and relationships with London or with British identity post a poll. So there are things that are absolutely missing, but to me that's kind of like a gallop that, just because you miss a step, the race still goes on, and those things will happen anyway. But you really think that Micheál Martin, and particularly because being a full Republican family or Republican Party would be far more engaged. And I would say this, that if there's a hound of Baskervilles kind of for unionism around who can call the border poll, there's also one for nationalism, because they're looking and saying that the power is vested in a Secretary of State. And really, in recent years, we've absolutely recognised that the Secretary of State in London aren't acting as neutral arbiters in any way, shape or form. And they will only do what's in London's interest rather than the interests of even the unionist people, let alone the entire population living in the north. So there is something that that is the responsibility of Dublin in particular, to explore what they are doing to plan for that provision in the Good Friday Agreement, and to make it far more specific, because we can't go on like this, and it's untenable for a Secretary of State to be quite so vague and to just push everyone away whenever it suits them.
And I want to change tact slightly, because Rory in the report talks about that we need to know the basic rules on the referenda, well in advance. And there's quite a lot of reference to alternate or supplementary approaches, about deepening democracy, if you like. I think the term is used, thick democracy, which I don't like, but deepen democracy. Mechanisms like citizens' assemblies and the role they could play, the Feminist Conversation Project. I wonder, what's your feeling about those sort of approaches? Would they be useful, or would they simply create more confusion? Alex?
Well, I think the nature of every referendum, and we've seen it, whether it's on same-sex marriage, abortion, some economic issues and so on, they throw up the most extraordinary kind of alliances. Groups of people who you would think would never in any normal circumstance work together in common cause find themselves doing that. And I think when you're talking about, this isn't, I don't want to belittle it, but or over-egg it, but what we're talking about, a referendum in the United Ireland, which in essence is what it would be. You're talking about the thing that matters most to everyone. Scratch every other, surface of their identity card, and it's the identity. It's who they are, it's who they feel themselves to be, it's who they want to be, becomes this huge issue. And I think that's why this will be when it comes, or if it comes, it'll be an extraordinary debate, because every single person across, the 32 counties, Ireland, the 2 jurisdictions, however we're going to describe it, every single person will be affected if the vote goes towards ending the union. So across all sorts of places in Ireland, people who haven't raised their voices in this issue for maybe 100 years, 50, whatever it is, will suddenly begin to say, do we really want? And it's one of those silly questions, but do we really want a million or so, unionists who are not happy? How do we accommodate them? How do we, assure them of their Britishness? Because somebody would say, look, well, we will accommodate them. The response from a unionist will be that even if unionism had been a lot more generous than it should have been, a lot more open-handed than it should have been, it's still probable that the vast majority of people from a nationalist background would still have wanted to flame once again, a nation once again. They would have still, that would have been their ultimate identity. And even though they mightn't have fallen out with unionism, quite like the British connection, quite like the unions, there was still that sense, we still want to live in the United Ireland. So if you're suddenly pushing a million unionists and saying, oh, well, you can still feel like you're British, and you can still wave a flag now and again you want to, and you can still have an orange parade if you want to, that's enough. That's like the stickers on the bicycle. That real sense of your identity and your state. The other thing, you look at the referendum on Scottish independence or even Welsh independence. Doesn't matter what the result is. Scotland votes to leave. Scotland ends up staying in the United Kingdom. It's still Scotland. Same with Wales, votes to leave. It's still Scotland. Northern Ireland, we vote, we lose. Northern Ireland disappears as a state. The union's identity disappears as a state. Their membership of another country disappears as a state. So all this thing about, how do you accommodate that? It's going to be important. That's what I was saying. It's really important that all the groups that will be impacted, and I say it'll be if there is a new United Ireland coming, and the debate hasn't even begun. We have no idea what it would look like. I mean, Andrei touched upon it then, Micheál Martin, I think it's, putting it bluntly, really couldn't be arsed. He's enough else on his plate to deal with. I'm not being unkind to him. I personally, I do like him, but I just think it is not his priority at the minute. There's so many issues that have to be asked. I wrote down, remember about 3 months ago, I ended up with 77. And I could add to that now. Once you start this debate, if the Secretary of State ever comes, there will be hundreds of questions I haven't even thought of. And coming back to your question, that's what's going to push it in. A citizens' assembly is not going to do it, because a citizens' assembly is a technical institutional vehicle which looks at pros and cons. What you'll be talking about is hundreds of groups working separately, sometimes working together, and extraordinarily, unionists will find friends across the border, which will come as a huge surprise. And maybe they should have looked for them 20, 30, 40 years ago. But this notion that you can just here's a border poll that's happening on the 20th of February 2030, whatever it's all over, doesn't work like that at all. The debate has to happen, and that goes back to the first question again. Andrei touched upon it. You cannot begin. Please God, and I say that as an atheist. Please God, we do not end up in a situation where it goes on and on and on for a few years, and then somebody goes, oh, let's have the border poll, when the debate hasn't been had, when all the people who need to be talked to, when all the government, and even the financial side of it, this notion of, I remember one leading Sinn Féin said to me, and I was down at the Dublin Mansion House a couple of years ago as their guest speaker, quite a lot of silence when I finished, but one of the points I said to one of them afterwards about the financial thing, and he just looked at me with a straight face, said, the British government owe us hundreds of millions in reparations. That has to be part of the deal. I remember thinking, good luck with that, mate. Good luck with that. You have to have something more extensive than that as part of what the financial future of United Ireland would look like.
And Andrei, how do we start, unpacking some of these 77 and more questions, and in such a way, as you said, that can actually incorporate that range of identities? I always remember the late Davy Irvine saying, an Irish American asked him, what are you? And he says, I'm Irish British. He says, don't be so silly. And Davy says, well, what are you? So, will some of these other, approaches actually help start answering some of these questions?
Seems to me that they will happen anyway. And why wouldn't we have more rather than less? So, for me, the first thing and the last thing that people, when they're talking about a changed arrangement, is health. That's what they talk about. They talk about the National Health Service free at the point of entry versus the kind of hybrid model that's in the south. And then, that becomes a really concerted conversation, but it's often without enough detail. And the opportunity of us exploring this and having time to do it is actually to come up with something much better that works better on the entire island. Because we recognise that we have two systems that are creaking under demand and lack of resources at the minute. So this gives us an opportunity to have an honest conversation, to bring together those minds. And so hopefully we won't have ministers describing their ministry as Angola going forward. Or even we have, you know, the opportunity for, you know, we saw that the two states meant that the repression of women was absolute on both sides of the border. And there was a violence against women and children that was institutionalized. So it isn't just that we will go forward knowing that that won't be the case. It will be a real case of ensuring that those rights are inbuilt and enshrined in a new dispensation, and that we can find relationships and understandings with each other, much as what Alex said there, in a new way. So it won't be about which flag I fly in July or at Easter. It's going to be about those experiences and issues that we have in common, and that we can build something that is much stronger together. In terms of having and I think Alex is absolutely right to raise all of those issues about how does that feel for a unionist, despite being, you know, this sizable minority. It can't be just a nod and a wink and a kind of, we'll let the Queen visit every so often. It needs to be something that people really can say, no, I am cherished. And, you know, that is going to require a long conversation and a big leap in understanding from where I'm sitting to where Alex is sitting. You know, we need a lot deeper conversations. And why wouldn't we have that? Because it seems to me that we coexist in places where we will find the easy things to talk about, but we avoid the hard things to talk about. And if we do this properly, and we do this with enough time and planning, we can do this. And even no matter what the end result is from the poll, we will be all the richer for it.
Sure, sure. Well, I'm conscious of our time, and I'm also conscious, actually, there's a couple of questions in the chat function, but I think to take some of this discussion forward, I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to introduce the next session of our webinar. Catherine, can you unmute? I think you're still muted.
Thank
and
you, Avila. Yeah.
And can I just thank Andrei and Alex for your contribution? Okay, Catherine.
Thanks, and to echo your thanks to Andrei and Alex for very rich contributions. And so I'm Catherine O'Rourke. I'm director of the Transitional Justice Institute, and in this part of the session, we're going to have a few short contributions from TJI colleagues on the theme of the report. So it falls to me just to open up with a few comments really on broader TJI work that addresses this specific theme around potential design of a referendum on a border poll. I was fortunate enough to attend the conference in February, and I want to thank Eilish and Rory for all of their efforts. Obviously, this is a debate that has gathered a great deal of traction in recent times, as has come out certainly from the comments today. But as I was reflecting on my comments, I was thinking about in 2005, I had joined the Institute as Christine Bell's research assistant, and she was working on a small project called Uniting Ireland, and which was a legal inquiry into sort of how might one go about uniting Ireland. And one of my fun sort of tasks was to phone around the political parties in Dublin to ask them what their plans were for uniting Ireland. And the responses I got sort of were generally of a theme, well, we'd welcome it, and we'll get back to you. Needless to say, they didn't get back to me with very elaborated ideas. So I think that does sort of say, certainly for me at least, it sort of brought out just how far we've travelled in the 15 years in that time. But it also, of course, speaks to the fact that whilst this is a new perspective and a new point in this debate, discussions around Northern Ireland's constitutional status, the constitutional status of the peace agreement, our constitutional futures have been pretty central to the work of the TJI since it's started. And I do think there's a few things that we brought to this debate sort of in the broad trajectory of the work that also comes through in very strongly in the report, which I commend to you. Certainly there's a comparative piece, and the report is very much about trying to learn from comparative experience on how a referendum could possibly be designed. And looking comparatively, particularly at the Belfast Agreement as a peace agreement, we do see that the provision for constitutional referenda is not entirely unusual. One could think of Sudan, South Sudan, their peace agreement. There are several examples of places where that happens too, and it can sometimes be helpful to take the heat out of a local debate by sort of pointing out that these Northern Ireland is not the first place to encounter these debates. And I think that is something that the TJI has really tried to bring this discussion and continues to. We've also quite a lot of work ongoing for a long time now on around the Bill of Rights, the discussion of the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, and indeed the All-Ireland Charter of Rights. And it does strike me that this might be potentially be more prominent in the discussion, because the discussion about the All-Ireland Charter of Rights is also about the discussion of a set of values that underpins the island more broadly as a political entity, if not necessarily a legal and constitutional one. And that discussion and process around shared values, the experience, and my colleague Anne Smith in particular, Leo Green, have done really good work on this. The experience of that All-Ireland Charter process to date has sort of said that it's been too top-down, it hasn't been sufficiently inclusive, and it hasn't been accompanied by political priority. So it seems to me there's already learning kind of going on there, and my colleagues continue to do important work on that question. And the other area where we've sort of constantly, I think, tried to draw attention to something that's come out already, but it is around the question of inclusion and sort of who gets to be included in these debates. And the question of inclusion cuts in a few different ways. But in particular, I think our work on gender stands to contribute quite a lot to this debate in ways that potentially offer ways forward, but also I think in ways that complicate the discussion. So, and I don't want to cut across Fidelma's contribution here too much, but just to say a few things that have, I think, come out in other work that we've done. It is the question of, for example, things like differential legal recognition of gender identity, differential access to rights of citizenship for same-sex families, our work on masculinities and how relationships between men tend to really structure much of these debates. Even where there is rhetorical reference to women's inclusion. Eilish and others' longstanding work on intersectionality, and I have to say that really came to mind for Alex's contribution. I was struck by, I suppose I wouldn't assume that one's national identity would be the primary element of this discussion were it to happen. I think there may be other axes of identity that are pertinent and relevant. And inclusion also, I suppose, around the construction of expertise in this debate. And this is a particular challenge and I suppose opportunity for those of us in the academy. At one level, the role we offer is expertise. I think the value we offer is a certain degree of legal expertise, comparative expertise, international expertise. But there's also the danger of excluding people by making these conversations overly expertly laden, and also I think the real danger of defining expertise in ways that are exclusionary, which is a constant, I think, challenge and risk for us in the academy. But I do hope that the TJI's kind of long-standing commitment to doing that in a way that's aware, to supporting processes that are inclusive, and also I think to working collaboratively with folks outside the academy is evident in our work to date and evident in sort of how we're trying to take this debate forward. And I do hope that the TJI can continue to be a space to sort of facilitate and enable these debates going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And Catherine has laid out very clearly what our thinking was behind holding this workshop and how it fits into the role of the university and academia in the society. Thanks also to Alex and Andrei for really stimulating, thoughtful discussion this morning. It was an honor to listen to that level of insight and that very honest and open discussion on these really big issues. So I just would like to thank them all, and of course thanks Avila. Avila's had to go to another meeting that she could not avoid, but thanks to her for her very able sharing this morning. I have to confess I'm not as far-sighted as Christine Bell or Catherine O'Rourke in that it was not particularly on my radar to think about these issues. in 2005, I think Catherine said, or even in 2015, sorry, even in 2015. What of course changes everything, many things, is Brexit and the decision in the referendum of the 23rd of June 2016, which opens up all these issues of borders, sovereignty, identity, that the Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement had found very nuanced, very careful compromises or solutions for a while. But it was clear to everyone, I think, as soon as the Brexit referendum passed, that this was a debate where we urgently needed to start thinking and getting prepared, because it is complex and contentious. So it was with that spirit that we endeavored to think about what are the comparative, what are the international lessons that we can learn. And so we gathered together experts from different disciplines across these islands to contribute. And we produced this report, which I think makes an excellent addition to anyone's coffee table. It's available as a free download, so please do make sure to take a look and look through it. And each of the presentations by our contributors is, even though the report itself is substantial enough, each presentation is relatively brief and full of insights, so I hope people will make use of them going forward. I mentioned Brexit. I think two of the lessons of Brexit are that quite important, seismically important issues can come onto the agenda very quickly, in the sense that the UK's exit from the European Union in 2010 or even in 2015 was largely a debate within one political party, rather than a massive public debate. And people sometimes tell me when I have these conversations, I don't think the South or the Dublin government would really want this, which is what Catherine was also alluding to, I think, in a slightly different way with her experience. But the other lesson, of course, is that governments and prime ministers don't get the results that they anticipate. David Cameron certainly did not anticipate the result of the Brexit referendum. And so that means it is important for those of us working in academia and elsewhere in the public sphere to think about these issues and to prepare for these issues, whatever one's view on the ultimate substantive question. So it's with that spirit that we produced this report, and we'll continue to engage on these questions in the future. But I'm now going to hand you over to my co-organizer, Eilish Rooney, to say a bit more about the project and other projects ongoing. So, Eilish.
Thanks very much, Rory, and thanks everyone for your contributions. It feels like it leaves me with very little more to say, but not being one to miss the opportunity. Let me begin by just a reflection I had whenever I looked at the report actually this morning. And like Rory and everyone who's spoken so far, I'd recommend it. What's great about the report is it captures not only the expertise that's presented, but it captures the engagement and the conversation that went on in the room, the questions and answers. And I think they're as valuable as anything else in the report. So I would really recommend, please have a look at it. But the phrase that came to mind this morning whenever I looked over it was unimagined futures. We held that workshop in February of this year. None of us could have imagined where we would be 6-8 months later. This was pre-COVID times, And it feels like the world we live in has changed almost utterly since then. And what if I can pull out two things that we've learned, and I'm not going to discuss them, just simply state them very obviously. One is the capacity and significance and importance of governance to manage crisis situations. There have been years back when people would say there's no point in discussing constitutional issues. What does it matter? That phrase, "you can't eat flags for breakfast," came across from some well-meaning and liberal circle, that constitutional matters weren't bread and butter matters. And what we've learned from the experience of COVID is that actually governance and state capacities and the rules and regulations under which states operate are critically important. And I'm just picking up on some of the comments that colleagues have made already. A second thing we learned, well, I suppose, was that the crucial importance and vitality of local civil society organisations. If you live in an estate in urban Belfast or Derry, you will know what I'm talking about, because local people at a local level, women's groups, community organisations, ex-prisoner groups, got together and organised themselves in response to the local crisis of COVID. And I think it's critically important never to lose sight of the connections between national structures, governance, and how that happens, and what happens locally. And sometimes I think it's good to take heart from what happens locally. And I'm thinking particularly of Alex's point about there being hundreds of conversations going on. Conversations are going on all the time between communities and interface areas on various issues of common interest between people. And sometimes we forget that. And within academic circles, sometimes we never notice or never take cognizance of what's going on. And that's been a particular interest of my own in relation to this conversation, how people are empowered to have the conversations that are necessary at local levels. So COVID has made a huge difference to our lives, but Brexit continues. And when I think back to February, we had certain expectations going on at the time, and it comes through in people's presentations, what they expected to happen at Brexit at that time, you know, the conversations that were happening, and all that has changed as well. And that's changed in unimagined ways also. You know, what's happened to the protocol? What's going to be the outcome next week? We don't know, and we live in that kind of uncertainty that's difficult to live within. The report makes a contribution to that. And I suppose lastly, what I want to say is, who could have imagined that a conversation on Irish unity would be simultaneously a conversation about rejoining European pluralism? That was unimaginable. And it's what we're talking about at the moment as well, because the referendums that we're envisaging, however far in the future, is a means of return to the European Union, to European pluralism. So the conversation isn't so much, as sometimes has been alleged, about narrow notions of unionist nationalism or narrow notions of Irish nationalism, but we're opening up the European universalism debate into this conversation. And that, even back in February, wasn't something that was clearly seen or clearly imagined. I'd like to end by encouraging people who are involved in this debate here and listening in to carry out conversations and to keep an eye on the Constitutional Conversations Group's invitations to join us in conversations in the future. I'd now like to hand over to my dear colleague, Fidelma, who's going to join us and basically have the last word. Over to you, Fidelma.
Thank you very much, Eilish, and that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. And thanks to Rory and Eilish for inviting me into these conversations. And they even placed my photograph the front cover of the report as well. So that is inclusion. Up in the top right-hand corner, Rory. I'm interested in looking at the gender dimensions of the constitutional debates that we're having at the moment. And I'm working with Eilish on a project, and we received much needed and very appreciated funding from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust to support that work. So I'll just speak from my own sort of perspective on the work that we're doing. Although obviously Eilish and I share a lot of similar interests. So my work is underpinned by the framework of pluralism. Just to outline why pluralism is important for me, pluralism and a pluralist approach to constitutional change pushes us away from just simply looking at processes such as a border poll, which no doubt is exceptionally important, and towards thinking about what kind of visions are emerging and what kind of values underpin those visions. So for me, a pluralist approach opens up those questions. Now, Andrei already alluded to sort of a particular kind of vision when she was talking, and I tried to write it down, but I didn't get it written down correctly, so I didn't get the end bit right. But she asked, how do we build a new Ireland where, I think it was all identities are cherished, or all identities of dignity? I can't remember what the exact words were. So for me, that actually is a pluralist vision emerging there. Now, if we can think about more broadly how much room there is for pluralism in our current conversations, that might illustrate why, you know, I'm so interested in this framework. So if we go back to 1998, the ground for pluralism and pluralist politics was pretty narrow. And for somebody like me, it's really interesting to hear the conversations and comments that are happening now, because I'm hearing the same things that we heard back in 1998. So, you know, some commentators have argued, I'm not arguing, I'm just saying some commentators have argued that, you know, the agreement was based around ethno-nationalist bargaining, and that really has shaped our politics since. That we still have this sort of bargaining, we still have these tensions there. So there wasn't much room really for pluralism there. And, you know, we were told, well, that's not the issue. Nobody's really interested in identities like women. You know, we'll sort that out later on. And we were also, you know, told maybe, you know, a little bit more positively, oh, well, once we get this in place, then we'll sort out all those other rights after that. Just be patient, just wait. And those institutions that could have supported pluralism, such as a Bill of Rights and the Civic Forum, they fell apart on us. And it always makes me smile when people say, well, the Civic Forum was completely ineffectual, Fidelma. And it makes me smile because I think of our assembly. You know, institutions like the Civic Forum were going to have to be allowed to develop and strengthen and you know, become reshaped as time went on. So what we ended up with pluralist politics, all those struggles around gender, sexuality and class, moving to the margins. And we have very long and difficult campaigns for what are basic human rights that other societies have been able to address. So I don't want to talk too long, so you better start sort of giving me signs. So what space is there for pluralism at the minute? Well, we've just had a lovely conversation between people of two opposing perspectives. But unfortunately, all of our conversations are not of that nature. So my first worry is that the ground will shrink in terms of pluralism and pluralist perspectives coming into these conversations, because to some degree, we have a masculinized space for debate. And what I mean by that is not that that space is populated by men. It's not because Rory O'Connell is in that space. Rather, I'm talking about a masculinist approach to politics. And that approach is divide the world into enemy and friend, and then crush your enemy, okay? Now, as a colleague recently noticed, this whole space has become weaponized. So that's, you know, that's one concern for those of us interested in pluralist politics. You know, how do we promote pluralism in that space? Well, Eilish and I want to look at how you do that at a very practical level, and the support from Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust is helping us do that. Because we're going to explore how spaces can be created to enable women to speak about these issues. And when you are speaking to women and having conversations between women, they have cross-cutting identities. So you're also creating a space for other identities to speak, albeit through women. You're also opening up an arena where you can talk about economic and social issues as well. So you can include them in the conversation. So we're at the very beginning of that work, at the very beginning. But we're excited about it. I think I speak for both of us when I say we're excited about it. What I want to do as part of this Constitutional Futures Initiative, which has been really important for me because normally I just go off and work on my own. It's been really important for me because it's made me realize that I need to strengthen my arguments for a pluralist approach to constitutional conversations, to make them more robust and to make them more convincing. Because I don't believe in the current form they're in, I am actually really convincing anybody of the value of pluralism and the value of inclusion, and that you need to make that a part of your process. You can't have a laundry list at the end of that process where you say, okay, we'll give you a couple of sort of basic human rights here that probably won't be particularly meaningful in the real world. You know, you have to bring all constituencies into these conversations. That's it.
Thank you, Fidelma. So we're moving towards the end of our session. One of our speakers from the workshop in February, Professor Aoife O'Donoghue, is joining us. And Aoife, would you like to say a few words on the workshop or the debate we've been having this morning?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Rory, for asking me. I very much appreciate it, and it is lovely to see people again. As Eilish said, February does seem such a long time ago now. And I really enjoyed going back and reading the report, and thank you for putting it, to both of you, for putting it together and putting the work in. I think this is exactly the kind of work we need to all be doing and reflecting on. The one thing I'd like to add, I suppose, to it would be is that I think one of the, and it's kind of come up with the shared island approach and the approach from the Republic, but also I think from Britain, is that there is, I think, an underappreciation of what change will require of both states. And I think it will lead to a change to the Republic's idea of itself. And I would think a positive change, and not things around the edges. I think people sometimes get a bit obsessed about particular words, like the word Taoiseach or something like that. Like that's something that, you know, that's the change, when actually the change would need to be a lot more fundamental than that. But also Britain, it will require Britain to rethink what Britain is. And also if there's a referendum, and I think correct what Alex said, if both governments do decide to get involved, whatever governments those are at that particular moment in time, of course, they will have to sell, I think, a positive vision of both. And one of the failures, I think, maybe in the Scottish referendum and in Brexit, from the British perspective, was that it didn't sell what the positive of the union, you know, the positive sides of it, as opposed to just saying we're stronger together, which, because of course, when you're talking about independence or moving with Scottish independence referendum, or you're talking about Brexit, that didn't quite make sense in the context of something that is a United Kingdom. But also I think it doesn't necessarily make context when you're talking about a bit joining another bit. So I think there needs to be a really, I think, a positive understanding of unionism, not just from a Northern Ireland perspective, but from a British-wide perspective. What beyond stronger together, beyond the sort of, for the everyday person, why is it positive? But also from the Republic's perspective. I think often the referendums, the Republic tend to get captured by expertise, including us lawyers, and I think maybe too much by the law, and around sort of trying to fix the bits of the past, when actually this is a great opportunity to rethink what, as an island, we could be, what we would like to be, to talk about the issues that Fidelma mentioned. I think very much in the Republic, the focus, the narrowness of the focus tends to be on fiddling around the edges and doing enough to make the unionist community feel better about the prospect, rather than creating an Ireland where maybe unionism would like to be, where it would be happy, where it could feel that it is a really positive part of the community, as opposed to sort of a characterization of unionism as only worried about the word Taoiseach or the word Doyle. I'm kind of obsessed with that kind of thing, as opposed to, I think both polities need to think about what they would be selling in a really positive way, rather than skirting around the edges. But thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak as well. But I really thank you to the TGI for starting, I think, a really positive conversation around this, a really one that is bringing in lots of perspectives, and I do think that's really, really important. So thank you.
Thank you, Aoife. I'm glad you join us. Alex, Andrei, would either of you like to say a last reflection before I close?
Can I one? Sorry, I wasn't here. No, just to say just as Aoife's point, that I think was a very important point, which I hadn't really thought about before in this debate. If we do have a border poll referendum, wherever it is, whichever governments are in power, I'd say it's going to depend on some unionists. If it's to be a united Ireland, it's going to depend on some unionists shifting over towards that side, and if it's going to remain the status quo, it'll probably depend on some soft nationalism shifting into the UK camp. I'm just wondering who will sell. I mean, who sells the Union? Who sells the United Kingdom to nationalists? Who sells United Ireland to unionists? Because, I mean, to be honest, I'm just thinking if someone like, you know, if Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage, you know, were to turn up promoting, you know, the union, I mean, a bit like having Burke and Hare at baptism or something like that, it's just going to really put people off. So I think, again, in this whole full-scale debate of how you win hearts and minds on the other side, because we both say unionists and nationalists have to maximize the vote on their own side, but to secure victory, they have to bring 10, 15%. How do you do that? We haven't discussed that this morning, and indeed, it's nothing. It's a debate I don't really hear, because in the same way, I remember saying at the Mansion House thing with Sinn Féin, I said, in terms of if there was a border poll, in terms of you being Sinn Féin in the background, so on, you are the very worst people to try and sell a United Ireland to unionism, and vice versa. You know, someone like Boris Johnson is probably the very worst person you can think of to sell the United Kingdom to soft nationalism. So it's just a little element of the debate there that I hadn't but at least 3 columns worth there. So thank you very much, Aoife, for that.
Thanks, Alex. Andrei, would you like to say last words?
I think that this has been a really positive conversation, plenty for me as someone who's engaged in the conversation a lot to think about, not least Catherine O'Rourke's point about multiple identities and cross-secting identities and how important that is, and recognising that from the get-go. There's also something that kind of sits that when we're having a measured and delightful conversation like this, that we also know that it isn't like this all the time.
Yeah.
So we put on our radios early in the morning and we know that what can trigger us does get triggered, and that the conversation can become quite unhealthy as a society that's come out of a 30-year conflict where we're victims of multiple traumas and complex traumas. Even if we haven't experienced particular harms, we can still carry trauma. And I think that we need to accommodate and appreciate that our conversations need to always not roll from almost an addiction to crisis. And this becomes another crisis moment, that we do kind of bring the tone down, that we do engage in a way that is empowering, that acknowledges each other and acknowledges that we may well carry some really awful harms, and they can be multiple and from different areas, not just conflict harms, but other areas too. But we will all bring those to the conversation, but we can do it in a way that becomes progressive and becomes healthy and actually contributes to healing.
Thank you, Andrei. So thanks again to Andrei, Alex, and Avila, and my colleagues in TJI, and Aoife, who joined us the last while. Conversation, dialogue, deliberation are common words we used a lot. Conversations will continue. There is a group led by University College London looking at issues around a unity referendum, and includes people like our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Kathy Bourne-Heenan, Professor Kristen Crennan and Katie Hayward in Queen's University Belfast, and many other experts in this field. They are launching a report of their findings on the 26th of November. They will be having a launch event that TJI will be co-hosting on the 10th of December. So do watch the space for those details to be confirmed. I know we had some questions on the chat box that we haven't been able to address as we had a fairly full agenda. But as I say, these conversations will continue, and I'm pleased, and Catherine will permit me, TJI is pleased to be a part of these conversations going forward. So thank you for a really fascinating morning or afternoon or wherever you are, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.